Someone offers mild feedback on something you did, not harsh criticism, just an observation, maybe even kindly meant, but your reaction is instant and massive. Defensiveness, justification, or a surge of anger that shocks you with its intensity. You know, even as it's happening, that your response doesn't match the situation, but knowing that doesn't stop it. This is the hallmark of what depth psychology calls a trigger. Not the stimulus itself, but the disproportionate response, the gap between what happened and what you felt. Your colleague mentions a missed deadline. Your partner suggests a different approach. Your friend offers unsolicited advice. Minor events, massive internal reactions. Here's what makes triggers so disturbing. You can see it happening. You're watching yourself overreact, recognizing the disproportion in real time, and you still can't stop the cascade. There's a split. The observing self who knows this is too much, and the reactive self who feels genuinely threatened, genuinely wronged, genuinely justified in the surge of heat and defensiveness. The knowledge gap reveals something crucial about how the psyche operates. Understanding why you react a certain way doesn't prevent the reaction. You can have perfect insight into your patterns, childhood wounds, attachment dynamics, core beliefs, and still find yourself in the same reactive loop the next time the trigger appears. Your body responds before thought intervenes. Heart rate spikes, chest tightens, blood rushes to your face. The physical machinery of reaction activates faster than conscious awareness can track. And then there's the repetition. The same triggers across different contexts. The same types of people who irritate you regardless of setting. You change jobs, cities, relationships, but somehow you keep ending up in the same emotional territory. Different faces, different circumstances, same rage rising in your chest. Same defensiveness, same feeling of being dismissed, controlled, not taken seriously, not respected. This repetition suggests something that most people resist acknowledging. If it keeps happening across different people and contexts, the origin isn't external. It's not bad luck. It's not that you keep encountering the same difficult personalities. The pattern is pointing inward. Carl Jung discovered that we're not as unified as we imagine. The psyche isn't a singular I making conscious choices. It's populated by what he called complexes, autonomous clusters of emotion and memory that behave like independent beings. When triggered, these complexes temporarily override your conscious ego. You become, in Jung's language, possessed by an emotional pattern that operates with its own logic, its own agenda, its own historical timeline that has nothing to do with the present moment. This isn't weakness. This is design. This is how a psyche works when it's been split against itself. When parts of you were buried so long ago that they now return only in distorted form, activated by present situations that your nervous system mistakes for past dangers. The disproportionate response isn't malfunction. It's your psyche signaling that something deeper is activated. Something that predates the present trigger. Something that wants to be seen. So where do these triggers actually come from? Why does your psyche contain autonomous patterns that override conscious choice? The answer lives in what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything you've learned to reject about yourself. But here's what most people misunderstand. The shadow doesn't consist only of moral darkness, of cruelty or selfishness or rage. It contains everything that was exiled, everything that drew disapproval, everything you had to bury to survive your particular childhood. The burial process begins early. From infancy through adolescence, you're learning what's acceptable, what gets you love, approval, belonging, what gets you rejection, punishment, the withdrawal of a parent's face. A child who expresses anger and receives cold silence learns quickly. A child whose assertiveness is met with, "Who do you think you are?" internalizes the message. A child whose sensitivity draws mockery builds walls around tenderness. You didn't just learn to hide these qualities. You internalize the hostile attitude toward them. The rejection came from outside, but you made it interior architecture. You became your own enforcer, pushing into shadow whatever threatened your belonging. And here's the crucial insight that reshapes everything. The shadow doesn't just contain what you think of as bad traits. It contains disowned vitality. Strength that was punished becomes inaccessible strength. Anger that drew abandonment becomes buried life force. Assertiveness that was shamed becomes locked away power to protect yourself, to advocate for your needs, to say no. Creativity that was dismissed, sensitivity that was mocked, desire that was condemned. Jung observed that roughly 80% of the shadow is pure gold. Qualities that could serve you, capacities that could enrich your life, energy that could fuel your actual living. But because these aspects of yourself were rejected at a time when rejection meant existential threat, they remain in exile. The more violent the original rejection, the harsher the punishment, the more complete the withdrawal of love, the more energy gets locked away maintaining the split. Contemporary neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited about this process. Emotion researcher James Gross demonstrated that suppression requires constant psychological energy, leaving less available for conscious living. You're running internal machinery 24 hours a day to keep certain contents out of awareness. The energy that could be animating your life is instead maintaining a dam against your own depths. This explains the economics of the shadow. Energy doesn't disappear, it transforms or it gets trapped. When you suppress anger, assertiveness, or any vital capacity, that energy doesn't evaporate, it calcifies into symptoms. It manifests as depression, which is often rage turned inward against the self. It erupts as explosive outbursts, sudden releases from an overpressurized system. It expresses through the body as chronic tension, fatigue, pain, the soma holding what the psyche won't acknowledge. Consider the person who learned early that anger was unacceptable, not just discouraged, forbidden, met with threats, with violence, with the terror of abandonment. They bury all aggression, all assertiveness, anything that could be coded as too much. They become the peacemaker, the accommodator, the one who never causes problems. Calm, measured, endlessly reasonable, until they're not, until something minor happens and they detonate with shocking intensity. Or they don't explode outward, they collapse inward into depression so profound they can barely function. Or their body breaks down with mysterious ailments no doctor can quite diagnose. This is the shadow's return. What you refused doesn't stay refused. It returns distorted. You no longer have access to healthy anger that protects boundaries. You only have access to explosive rage or complete shutdown. You no longer have access to appropriate assertiveness. You only have passive collapse or aggressive defensiveness. The qualities you rejected to survive childhood now limit you as an adult. The strength that could protect you is locked in shadow. The anger that could signal boundary violations is buried so deep you can't access it until it erupts and destroys what you're trying to preserve. And here's where the architecture of triggers reveals its deeper logic. You don't experience this buried darkness in yourself. You can't. That's what burial means. But you do experience it constantly, vividly, with absolute conviction in everyone else. This is projection, the mechanism that turns internal split into external conflict. Jung articulated the principle with surgical precision. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Not some things, everything. The disproportionate irritation, the visceral disgust, the moral outrage you feel towards certain people. These aren't just reactions to what's out there. They're mirrors reflecting what you've refused to see and hear. The mechanism operates with elegant cruelty. Traits you've denied in yourself don't disappear from awareness. They become the lens through which you perceive the world. Psychologists Newman, Duff, and Baumeister validated this empirically. When you suppress thoughts of undesirable traits, those trait categories become highly accessible, cognitively available. You use them constantly when forming impressions of others, while remaining utterly blind to their presence in yourself. You become convinced they are that way, not that you're projecting. That would require the kind of self-reflection projection specifically prevents. You see their selfishness with crystalline clarity, their arrogance, their neediness, their anger. You can catalog every detail of their flaw, describe precisely how it manifests, predict when it will appear. What you cannot see is the same pattern operating in your own psyche. Consider the person who buried all selfishness in childhood. They learned early that attending to their own needs meant being bad, wrong, unlovable. So they became the giver, the caretaker, the one who never asks for anything. And now they're surrounded by selfish people. Everywhere they look, selfish coworkers, selfish partners, selfish friends, people who take without giving, people who center themselves without consideration for others. Their judgment is absolute. They can see the selfishness operating with microscopic detail. They cannot see their own disowned need for self-care appearing as others' narcissism, cannot see that what enrages them in others is precisely what they've forbidden in themselves. The stronger your moral certainty about someone else's flaw, the more likely you're encountering your own shadow wearing their face. Relationships become the primary theater for this dynamic. Your intimate partner becomes a screen for your shadow material. This is why you're often attracted to someone and then triggered by the same qualities. The confident person draws you. Finally, someone who can take charge, who knows what they want. 6 months later, you're enraged by their arrogance, their dominance, their refusal to consider your perspective. Or you're drawn to their gentleness, their emotional availability, their sensitivity. Then you find yourself disgusted by their weakness, their neediness, their inability to handle conflict. What happened? Did they change? No, you're encountering the split in your own psyche, the disowned opposite of your persona, projected onto someone close enough to carry it. These projections often form complementary patterns. The conflict-avoidant person partners with someone who seems to create conflict. The overly responsible person partners with someone irresponsible. Each carries what the other has buried. The avoider has disowned their own anger and capacity for confrontation. The conflict seeker has rejected their need for peace and harmony. They're unconsciously attempting to complete themselves through the other, while simultaneously being triggered by the very qualities they lack. The telltale signs of projection operate like diagnostic markers. Disproportionate intensity. Your emotional response exceeds what the situation warrants. Repeated pattern. You encounter this same flaw in different people across different contexts. Inability to see nuance. They become all that negative trait, no complexity allowed, an emotional charge that won't discharge through talking, through understanding, through any amount of processing. The irritation remains no matter how much you analyze it. Because you're not actually irritated at them. You're encountering the part of yourself you've exiled, and your psyche is doing everything possible to keep you from recognizing the mirror. The question emerging now isn't whether you project. All human beings project. The question is, what happens when a projection gets triggered? What's the mechanism that creates that sudden sense of takeover, that feeling of being possessed by a reaction you can observe but cannot control? Jung's discovery of complexes began with something measurably physical. At Bergholtzli Hospital, he conducted word association experiments, speaking stimulus words to patients and measuring their response times. Certain words produced visible disruption, delayed reactions, speech disturbances, changes in breathing and heart rate. Specific clusters of words reliably activated what Jung termed feeling-toned complexes, emotionally charged networks of memory and meaning that behaved like independent beings within the psyche. This wasn't metaphor. Jung observed that these complexes operate with their own willpower. When activated, they temporarily override conscious ego functioning. In moments of complex activation, you experience what Jung called diminished responsibility. You're genuinely not fully in control. You know this experience intimately. You feel the blood rushing up into your head. Your chest tightens. You're aware you're about to overreact, aware the situation doesn't warrant this intensity, and you cannot stop the cascade. In that moment, Jung suggested, something else has taken the wheel. A part of you with its own emotional logic, its own historical timeline, its own protective agenda. The architecture of a complex has specific structure. At its core sits an emotional wound, often from early life. Around this core accumulate layers of associated memories. Every time the wound was touched, every situation that resembled the original injury. These memories aren't stored as narrative. They're encoded as feeling states, body sensations, reactive patterns, and wrapped around everything. Protective strategies develop to prevent the wound from being touched again. When a present situation resembles the complex's core theme, activation occurs. It's not a conscious process of recognition. Your nervous system detects pattern match at a level beneath thought. Suddenly, memories flood, emotions surge. Your body responds with the physical signature of the original threat, heart racing, muscles tensing, breath shortening. Behavior follows automatically, running scripts written decades ago. This is why insight alone doesn't stop triggers. You're not reacting to the present moment. You're reliving the past through the present trigger. Your colleague's tone of voice matches your father's voice when he was about to criticize. Your partner's request matches your mother's pattern of making you responsible for her feelings. The situations are different. The nervous system's response is identical. Contemporary trauma research validates this mechanism with precision. Psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk mapped how traumatic experiences encode in implicit memory, emotional impressions stored without narrative context. When activated, these implicit memories produce what he termed emotional flashbacks, overwhelming re-experiences of past trauma without visual memory, without conscious awareness of origin. You feel the terror, the rage, the shame, but your mind attributes these feelings to the present situation, not recognizing they belong to history. This parallels exactly what Jung described as complex activation. You're not in the present, you're time traveling. The emotional reality you're experiencing is decades old, but it feels utterly current, utterly justified by what's happening now. Richard Schwartz's internal family systems therapy arrived at the same architecture from a different direction. Working with clients, Schwartz noticed that what appear to be conflicting aspects of personality function more like distinct sub-personalities, what he calls parts, each with its own perspective, feelings, and protective intentions. What Jung termed complexes, IFS terms parts. Both frameworks recognize that the psyche is naturally multiple, not singular. Both emphasize that these autonomous elements have positive intent even when their actions prove destructive. The angry part isn't trying to ruin your relationships. It's trying to protect something vulnerable. The defensive part isn't sabotaging your growth. It's preventing you from feeling the shame that once felt annihilating. These parts developed when you needed them. They're still running protection programs written for a childhood that ended long ago. And here's what makes complex activations so destabilizing. These aren't just mental phenomena. Complexes have what Jung called somatic innervations. They live in your body, not just your mind. When a complex activates, it doesn't just change your thoughts, it commandeers your nervous system. Jung observed that in moments of high emotional activation, it's as if the complex has a body of its own, localized in your physical form. This is why the work of integration must be embodied, not merely cognitive. Understanding why you get triggered doesn't stop the triggering. The complex operates at the level of nervous system, beneath the reach of conscious thought. Your body remembers what your mind has tried to forget. But before we can address integration, there's one more layer to understand. The mechanism that ensures complexes stay buried, that keeps shadow material in exile, that transforms any threat to your constructed identity into existential terror. Shame is the guardian at shadow's gate. You feel ashamed of what you've buried, and this shame ensures it stays buried. Not guilt, which says, "I did something bad," and can motivate repair. Shame, which says, "I am bad," and threatens the very foundation of belonging. Researcher Brené Brown identified the existential quality of shame with precision. It's the intensely painful feeling that you are fundamentally flawed, unworthy of love and belonging. When shadow material threatens to surface, shame activates immediately. If others see this part of me, my anger, my need, my weakness, my desire, I'll be rejected, cast out, abandoned. And for a psyche shaped in childhood, abandonment still registers as annihilation. The parts you're most ashamed of are often the parts that hold your power. The aggression you buried could protect your boundaries. The selfishness you rejected could honor your legitimate needs. The sexuality you suppressed could animate your aliveness. But shame has convinced you these qualities are evidence of your fundamental defectiveness. So they stay locked away, and the energy that could serve your life instead maintains the prison. This creates what might be called borrowed identity. When your sense of worth depends on external validation, on others' approval, recognition, acknowledgement, their reactions carry enormous weight. Their opinions don't just inform you, they determine you. Any criticism becomes existential threat. Any feedback pierces not just your actions, but your core. This is why mild observations trigger disproportionate defensive rage. The persona you've constructed, calm, competent, good, strong, is all that stands between you and the shame of being fundamentally flawed. Psychiatrist Heinz Kohut mapped this dynamic at its extreme in what he termed narcissistic injury and narcissistic rage. When an inflated self-image is threatened and the hidden, true self risks exposure, the result is emotional trauma that overwhelms defenses and devastates pride. The response, narcissistic rage, functions as a self-righteous defensive assault intended to eliminate the source of threat. But this same mechanism operates in less extreme forms throughout the personality spectrum. When your persona is challenged, when your constructed identity is questioned, shadow proximity creates anxiety that erupts as anger. The shame-rage cycle runs with mechanical precision. A trigger activates shame. Shame threatens your fragile self-structure. The psyche cannot tolerate the feeling of being fundamentally defective, so it externalizes, "I'm not flawed, you are." The rage that erupts isn't really about the other person. It's a defensive maneuver protecting you from feeling the buried shame. Then the rage itself creates alienation from others, which produces more shame, which must be buried more deeply, which creates more pressure in the system. Research by psychologists Tangney and Deering confirmed that shame acts as a mediator between pathological personality traits and aggression. The pathway is direct. Shame-prone individuals experience higher levels of anger, hostility, and aggression. Shame doesn't reduce destructive behavior, it fuels it. And beneath the shame-rage fortress lies the mechanism of borrowed identity. When you've outsourced your sense of worth to others' perceptions, you've given them control over your internal stability. Their approval grants you permission to feel okay. Their disapproval activates the core wound. You need them to see you a certain way, competent, kind, strong, successful, because without that external mirror reflecting the right image, you lose contact with any internal sense of inherent value. This is what makes triggers so destabilizing for individuals with borrowed identity structures. Criticism isn't information about your behavior, it's confirmation of your worst fear, that you are, in fact, fundamentally defective. The rage that erupts is proportional not to what was said, but to what that statement threatens to reveal about the self you've been desperately concealing. What shadow material actually needs is precisely what shame prevents: compassionate witness. When buried parts emerge and are met again with disapproval, shaming, rejection, the very responses that exiled them initially, they retreat further into darkness. But when shadow contents are received with curiosity, with acceptance, with attempts at understanding, something shifts. The energy locked within them begins to release. The work ahead requires meeting what you've been fleeing, not with the harsh judgment that created the split, but with a different kind of attention. This shift from shame-based control to compassionate containment is where transformation becomes possible. The instinct when you recognize these patterns is to try harder to control them, to manage your triggers more effectively, to suppress your reactions more completely, to become better at not feeling what you feel. This is precisely the strategy that created the problem. Control, in the psychological sense, means using willpower to keep emotions out of consciousness, to suppress their expression, to maintain a calm exterior regardless of interior storm. It feels like the solution. It's actually the mechanism maintaining your fragmentation. Emotion researcher James Gross mapped the neuroscience of this failure. Suppression doesn't reduce internal emotional experience, it only hides external expression. You're still feeling everything inside. Your heart rate is still elevated. Your nervous system is still flooded with stress hormones. Your body is still carrying the activation. But now you're also running the exhausting machinery of concealment, which drains psychological energy and leaves less available for actual living. The alternative isn't letting emotions run wild, acting out every impulse. It's a different relationship to feeling itself. What psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion termed containment, the capacity to receive, hold, and transform raw emotional experience rather than suppress or discharge it. Bion derived this concept from observing mother-infant interactions. The infant experiences overwhelming, nameless feelings and projects them into the mother through crying, thrashing, distress. An attuned mother receives these unbearable emotions, metabolizes them through what Bion called reverie, her own internal processing, and returns them to the infant in more manageable form through soothing presence, naming, understanding. Over time, the infant internalizes this containing function and develops self-containment, the ability to stay present with intense feelings without being overwhelmed or needing external rescue. This is the shift required now. Not control, squeezing emotions out of existence. Containment, holding them in consciousness long enough for transformation to occur. Raw rage can become understood anger. Nameless anxiety can become specific fear with clear object. Overwhelming shame can become recognized vulnerability. The first movement is differentiation, learning to experience emotion as something happening within you rather than what you are. Not, I am angry, but I am experiencing anger. This creates what might be called the observer position, a witnessing standpoint that can be present to feelings without merging with them. Neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman demonstrated that the simple act of labeling emotions activates the prefrontal cortex and helps regulate limbic reactivity. Saying to yourself, I'm noticing anger arising, creates measurable neural distance from the emotion. You're still feeling it fully, but you're feeling it from a place of freedom rather than bondage, awareness rather than possession. Your body announces complex activation before your mind registers it. Heart rate changes, chest tightens, breath becomes shallow, heat rises to your face, jaw clenches. These somatic signatures are early warning signals, complex activation in its initial stages before full takeover occurs. Learning to read your body's language gives you the gap between stimulus and response where choice lives. This requires developing what researchers call interoceptive awareness, the capacity to accurately perceive sensations arising from inside your body. Studies link disrupted interoceptive awareness to depression, PTSD, anxiety, and substance use disorders. You cannot regulate what you cannot feel. You cannot transform what you cannot identify. The body must become legible again. The practice of tracking begins simply. Notice who repeatedly triggers you. Not to blame them, but as data. The person who triggers you is pointing at your shadow. The pattern is the portal. Always authority figures. Examine your complex around power. Always people who seem selfish. Investigate what you've rejected about self-care and legitimate need. Always criticism of your competence. Track the persona structure that requires being seen as capable to maintain identity. Then ask the question projection makes almost impossible. Where is this trait in me? The resistance you feel to the question is itself the answer. I'm not controlling, you insist, jaw tight, voice hard. The very intensity of your denial reveals the buried content. What you refuse to consider in yourself appears with magnified clarity in others. But intellectual recognition isn't enough. The shadow must be engaged directly, in its own language. Jung's active imagination technique creates space for this encounter. You enter a relaxed but alert state. Allow an image or figure to emerge that represents the angry part, the defensive part, the shameful part, and then you dialogue with it. Not visualization where you control the outcome. Genuine encounter where the figure speaks back, often saying unexpected things. The internal family systems approach provides parallel methodology. When a reactive part activates, the rage, the defensive shutdown, the pleasing, you don't attack it or try to eliminate it. You approach with curiosity. What are you trying to protect? What happens if you don't do your job? What do you need? These parts have positive intent. The rage is protecting a vulnerable exile. The shutdown is preventing unbearable shame from surfacing. The pleasing is ensuring you won't be abandoned. Meeting defensive parts with aggression strengthens them. Meeting them with curiosity transforms them. They've been running the same protective program for decades, waiting for someone to acknowledge their impossible burden and offer a different way. And here's the integration work that most directly contradicts cultural conditioning. You must acknowledge your capacity for darkness, for cruelty, for manipulation, for harm. The parts of the shadow you most need to own are precisely the ones you're most convinced you don't possess. Jung insisted that recognizing the dark aspects of your personality is essential for wholeness. Not acting on them, recognizing them. The person who cannot acknowledge their capacity for violence is more dangerous than the person who knows exactly what they're capable of and chooses restraint. Unconscious destructiveness gets enacted. Conscious darkness gets contained. This is the paradox at integration's heart. Admitting, I too could do this, makes you safer, not more dangerous. Because now the capacity is visible, related to, ethically engaged. It's no longer operating in the shadows, seizing control when complexes activate. It's been brought into the light of consciousness, where choice becomes possible. True peace is not the absence of anger. It's a transformed relationship to it. Most people imagine peace as a state of perpetual calm, never triggered, never reactive, emotions smoothed into gentle equilibrium. This is the peace of suppression dressed in spiritual language. What Jung called individuation produces something entirely different. the capacity to hold emotional opposites without fragmentation, to feel rage fully without being possessed by it, to experience intense emotion and still maintain connection to your observing center. This is peace as robust capacity, not fragile performance. You still get triggered. The difference is that you're no longer taken over. The complex activates. You feel the familiar heat rising, the chest tightening, and you recognize what's happening. I'm being complexed right now. That recognition creates the gap where freedom lives. Not freedom from emotion, but freedom within it. Anger becomes information rather than identity. It signals boundary violations, misaligned values, unmet needs. When filtered through integrated shadow rather than unconscious complexes, anger can be metabolized into clear, grounded assertion. You can say no. You can withdraw. You can advocate for yourself. And you can do these things without needing to attack, without collapsing into shame, without the disproportionate intensity that characterized your reactivity when shadow material operated in darkness. As more shadow content integrates, something shifts in your relationship to external validation. The ego becomes less dependent on others' opinions because it's anchored in what Jung called the self, the inner regulating center of the total psyche. This isn't the ego inflating itself into grandiosity. It's the ego finding its right relationship to a deeper, more stable core. Identity is no longer borrowed from others' perceptions. It's rooted in experienced inner totality. Criticism can be received as information rather than existential threat. Approval is pleasant but not necessary for stability. You can remain centered even when emotionally stirred because your sense of who you are doesn't depend on maintaining a particular image or receiving specific external responses. This is what makes triggers lose their leverage. When your worth isn't contingent on being seen as competent, criticism of your competence can't shatter you. When your identity doesn't require being perceived as calm, someone calling you angry doesn't destabilize your core. The persona, that carefully constructed social mask, loosens its grip. You become more of who you actually are and less of who you needed to appear to be. Jung articulated the path with characteristic precision. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. There is no route around the shadow, only through it. Every trigger you experience is an invitation, not to react, not to suppress, but to recognize, to ask what's being activated, to wonder what part of yourself is trying to break through into consciousness. What you've been calling your enemies are the abandoned parts of yourself, waiting to come home. The anger you rejected holds your capacity to protect boundaries. The selfishness you buried holds your right to honor legitimate needs. The weakness you exiled holds your capacity for genuine intimacy. The darkness you've been fleeing contains, as Jung observed, roughly 80% gold, qualities that could serve you, capacities that could enrich your life, energy that could fuel your actual living. Integration releases this vitality. The energy previously locked in maintaining internal warfare, the constant suppression, the projection, the defensive rage, the shame management, becomes available for living. You have access to your full spectrum of human capacity. Strength and vulnerability, assertion and receptivity, fierce boundaries and tender openness. Not as contradictions to manage, but as polarities to inhabit. Relationships transform when you stop projecting shadow. You can see others with less distortion. You can engage conflict without needing to make them the enemy. Real empathy becomes possible, not the performance of understanding, but genuine capacity to hold another's experience, because you've learned to hold your own darkness without annihilating yourself. This is not comfortable work. It's not a weekend workshop revelation or a technique you master and complete. Integration is lifelong practice. New layers of shadow emerge at every developmental stage. Each integration reveals deeper material waiting to be acknowledged. But the relationship to the work transforms. What began as battle with yourself becomes curious exploration. The parts you've been at war with become allies in the project of becoming whole. Jung suggested that if a person only learns to deal with their own shadow, they've done something real for the world. Individual shadow work ripples outward, less projection onto others, less unconscious enactment of destructive patterns, less participation in collective shadow dynamics that fuel division, scapegoating, and violence. The path is dark, but what we find there isn't our enemy. It's the gold we buried to survive, waiting to make us whole. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment. What triggers have you noticed? What patterns are you becoming curious about? What's one shadow quality you might be ready to reclaim? Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.